Our political commentators are with us now, Neale Jones and Liam Hehir. Kia ora koroa, welcome both.
Kia ora.
Atamarie.
Now, Neale was Chief of Staff to the former Labour Leader Jacinda Ardern. Before that was Chief of Staff to Andrew Little. He's the Director of Public Affairs firm Capital, and I think doing some volunteering for Andrew Little during his forthcoming mayoral campaign. Is that happening?
Yes.
Liam, I'm just trying to look up your exclusions. Liam is a lawyer based in Palmerston North. He is a member of the National Party, and I'm struggling to think of the other bits. Liam, can you help me out with that?
I'm not nearly as important as Neale, so I don't have too much else to disclose.
You're important to
I'm
me,
a Catholic, does that count?
It depends. Here we are. He's a Palmerston North lawyer, political commentator and National Party member, and a Catholic, which may or may not have any relevance to anything. Okay, let's get into your takeouts from the budget, as always, in the ensuing days, and this will continue. More and more and more will become revealed, will be finickled out. I think 116 things were cut, but basically it was a story of financial reprioritisation. Liam, this was how the new operating spend anyway was kept to 1.3 billion. What did you make of the overall tone, tenor, and the key parts of the budget?
Yeah, I'd say it was more of a holding pattern budget. Right, so you're reallocating things across the overall government spending program, but really it felt to me like it was light on gimmicks, which is actually a good thing. There were cuts, there was restraint, but it really felt to me like the government is putting off some of the more structural, bigger challenges that we face, in the hopes that at some point soon, economic growth is going to ride in like the cavalry and sort of resolve those problems. And so, there certainly was a budget of restraint and cuts here and there. They were discreet. They were in various parts where the government claims it's going to have the most impact. But really, there's no plan here to solve our economic woes. It's waiting for the economic growth to come, and that's something the government can't control.
Well, there was one that wasn't so discreet. We'll get to that in a moment. But the other matter is, to your other point, those books are looking worse, if anything. The growth, the return to some kind of some substantial GDP growth is fallen back again. Surplus 2029 has reached its wafer thin, and only under the government's new exclusion of ACC from the Obergall. So that hope that the cavalry's riding in to try and increase tax revenue and turn things around, the books were pretty bleak on that front, Liam.
Absolutely, and the debt's very worrying. So it's going to peak at 15 billion forecast deficit now, and there's only so much the government can do before it's got to start making some hard decisions. But I guess the confidence is still there that the evil day hasn't come yet, and that's always going to be the hope of governments, right? Is that actually we can grow our way out of the problem. Now, even if we assume that the Treasury forecasts aren't optimistic, which we can always assume that they will be. I mean, we don't know what negative things are going to happen in the coming years. It's still like really, really tight. But I think every budget might be like this for a long time now, simply because of the fact. It's
kind of the point we were asking the Minister about this on Friday. What comes next year? You won't be able to pluck another pay equity slash out of the sofa, nor even the KiwiSaver subsidies. And
yet superannuation is going to continue to be this, expanding expense that we have. And so, for all governments, I think, the days of easy budgets where you've got money to throw around, that might well be in the past, at least for a long time.
Neale, your take.
I should declare, first of all, that my firm does some work for a union and a provider group that have an interest in pay equity, but the following are my own views, which is I think this budget cannot be spoken about other than in the context that there is a moral disgrace, I think, in taking $12.8 billion out of the pockets of some of the lowest paid, hardest working women in New Zealand. Nicola Willis said that it wasn't about the money. Now it appears it is about the money. And these were people who have been fighting for years for justice. They are people who had quite advanced, including through the into the ERA. Some of them had in their contracts written into them reviews on pay equity. That's all been legally extinguished with no process whatsoever. And this is essentially theft of working women's money to make the budget add up. And it is a disgrace, and I think that tars the budget. In terms of the rest of it, look, I agree with Liam that it doesn't really tackle the big issues. I think that the best thing long term they had was the investment boost, but again, $6.6 billion, uncapped, so it may be higher, and pretty poorly targeted. You're looking at things like vehicles and commercial property being included, not just small and medium businesses, but multinationals as well. So this looks like it could end up being a very expensive giveaway to things that won't necessarily move the dial. And I think when you look at some of the other cuts they've made, these all fall on working people. You look at the cuts to government contribution of KiwiSaver. People on $200,000 a year, they don't notice that. People on minimum wage do. The increase in employer contribution, Treasury says 80% of that's going to come out of lower wage increases. You've got the freezing of the repayment threshold for student loans, which again will hit low-income people. And you have 18 and 19-year-olds being told they've got to rely on their parents, which if you're in a comfortable middle-class family with a spare bedroom, that might be easy. But I know from my life and people around me that it's not always that easy. And so people are going to suffer.
Okay, a couple of things. The theft of working men's money, we just need to address that. What you're arguing is that the future pay rises the Treasury itself presumed might result from claims underway is what has been sacrificed here. The Minister says we've still got money in the kitty for future claims, but clearly the quantum of them is anticipated to come down. And Liam, I'm really interested in your take on this. The problem that National has, and it's not ACT's problem, it's the problem that National has, was the lack of process around this. You cannot stand up and argue that things had expanded beyond what they were supposed to be, and all sorts of things were now being brought into the picture under the auspices of it being pay equity. You can't argue that that's happening and then not have a process that makes even a sliver of an argument to support that, because there's no select committee and there's not even regulatory impact reports on this. How are they going to go continuing to explain what they've relied on for such a big chunk of this budget?
Well, do you want the substance or the politics, or both?
Both.
Because on the substance is that if it really is the case that there was no reason for using urgency, as governments have in the past when they needed to do something that would prevent a flood of claims. For example, when they revalidated all those speed limits that had expired, then why would officials have advised that route be taken? That was official advice. That's something I very, very rarely see reported, was that the government was acting on official advice there. But regardless, the politics are just abysmal. It looks awful. There's no way that you can try and explain it by reference to the substance or the reasoning. It doesn't just look really, really bad for the government. Now, the government clearly also didn't want people to draw a link between the law change and the books. But it's very clear. There's only so much you can bury something and hide it. But it's very, very obviously the case that yes, that is a big component of the government claiming to have things under control. The only saving grace for the government is that it now makes it very difficult for Chris Hipkins to have to rely or have to promise to put it back, and now explain where he's coming up with a better part of $13 billion to do so. Because that does open him up to a tax increase or a show me the money moment. Now, he's very quickly first of all, he was a little bit uncommitted, but soon enough, he came around to committing to put it all back in. Got to be really clear on that. But now the question becomes, well, how are you going to pay for it? Because like it or not, the legal settings that were in place were going to result in this enormous liability. And so that is at least gives National the chance of a counterpunch.
This is the issue that's going to be spun back on Labour, isn't it? And it's not just this year again. That next budget and every budget going forward, I think they've got something like $2.8 billion of new spending. A large chunk of that will just be population growth and inflation growth and the likes of health. So again, you're looking at a very constrained budget next year, and that's if the GDP growth that's predicted is delivered, which I think is actually pretty flat for this forthcoming year anyway. So then it comes back to Labour, and they're being careful. Chris Hipkins is being careful how he's responding to his own finance spokesperson and saying we don't know what the sum is yet, we haven't seen the numbers. So he's sort of committing to restoring a sum.
Well, he's committed to restoring the rights that have been extinguished by the government on pay equity and giving those workers a chance to make those claims again. I think where he's been a bit cautious is that $12.8 billion, these are negotiations, so, that's a contingency. Secondly, the government hasn't released the details behind those numbers, so it's not as simple as saying you need $13 billion. But look, if that's what it costs, that's what it costs, and they've got to be prepared for that. I think for Labour, there is a way through this, which is that we're not a poor country. We should be richer than we are, and we should try and grow the economy. We're not poor. What's happened is we've had a government that has hollowed out our tax base. They gave $15 billion of tax cuts after the election, $3 billion of that to landlords. They've just given another $6.6 billion on the investment boost. These are large sums of money. Labour's going to have its own tax policy. It looks like it's heading towards a CGT. Again, even though that takes a while to come in, if you've got future revenues, well, I don't know what's so funny about that.
We'll come to Labour in a moment.
When you've got future revenues coming in, that does mean you've got a little room to play with in terms of your debt. So I think it's perfectly feasible for Labour to add that up. I think the issue will be they'll need to have a fiscal plan before the election, which includes their spending, their debt track, and their tax policy. I think a year and a half out from the election, it's probably a bit early to be expecting that from them. Certainly the last National Party in opposition didn't have their fiscal plan ready this time. Here's the reality.
There is a structural deficit. There is a growth in debt all the way up, I think, to 45% of GDP, and depending on the policy they come out with, that may continue to worsen. The only way this incumbent government, can put up an argument of being back even to break even by 2029 is what the approach is taken with respect to cuts. Unless you do your taxes, and here's Labour's challenge: how long does it take for a CGT to start returning any significant revenue?
But again, to my point, if you know that you've got that revenue coming, you've got a bit more leeway in terms of debt because you know that money's coming in the future. The point I would make is we keep saying, oh, look how terrible the books are. The books are terrible because the government has reduced the tax base and the economic growth has been anemic.
That's not the only reason they're terrible. They're terrible because debt has ballooned in recent years.
Yeah,
some of it unquestionably
the previous Labour government was going to go back to surplus faster than National is now. Politics is about choices, and the current government has chosen to give away a large part of our tax base. They haven't grown the economy, and that's not all their own fault. There's international factors. But to then say, well, that's Labour's fault, I don't think it is.
Okay.
I think Labour can come back with policies around debt and tax and spending that will add up and will be more progressive. It
was interesting talking, Liam, to the Finance Minister on Friday about the fact that they are shrinking government as a proportion of the economy, which centre-right supporters are probably welcome to see. But it's happening at the time where the private sector is flatlining as well, and the old counter-cyclical Keynesian argument was, when your private sector is struggling, when you're struggling with growth, that's a chance for government to put a bit of an injection in. And what Nicola Willis said, we tried that for 6 years and it didn't go very well. I presume she's alluding to the tax cuts with that as well. How much are they going to have to defend, as Neale is portraying here, their contribution to the operating budget's challenges next year?
The incumbent was always going to carry the can, right? Whether or not it's fair or not. If I go back to when sort of 2018, 2019, Neale, I think you might have given us a bit of a guideline about how long you thought governments can keep blaming previous governments. I don't think that time's expired yet, has it? Or is that only a leeway that Labour governments enjoy? Because I think, we're still in the first term, and I think we're still in that place where I think there is going to be, ultimately you are going to carry the can, but you can still credibly blame some of the previous lot.
You are accountable though for your own choices, and so specifically. So the point I'm making is that if the government claims there's no money, the fact they've given away, I think now $21 billion in tax cuts, that seems quite relevant to the fact there's no money.
It's not enough, and so this is what we can have the fifth go. Is it how many times have we had promise of a CGT? How credible? How possibly credible is it for Labour to go into the next election promising a capital gains tax again? Right? What is the credibility of Labour on that tax?
Well, to be fair, every time they've promised it, they've lost. And the one time they did promise, and under Ardern, they only promised a working group. So,
hang on. Between 2020 and 2023, who was in government?
Yeah, Labour and Jacinda Ardern had ruled out doing a CGT. So
because she lost her nerve.
Parties,
but she believed in it.
Well, no,
but she lost her nerve.
If you let me finish, because
it's like the so-called landlord tax cuts where we had interest deductibility being allowed. Every single time that this enormous spending program or these things have been trotted out to be claimed that they'll pay for them, time and time again. $12.8 billion, if we take that as a credible figure, we can only go off that figure. The CGT is not going to cover that.
Liam,
interest is deductibility being taken away again is not going to cover that.
Liam,
you can only spend these savings once, Neale.
Okay. Yeah.
Just to correct you, it was Winston Peters who killed the CGT, and that's why Ardern.
Labour was in power without Winston Peters from 2020 to
Yes,
2023. If she really believed it was necessary to solve the fiscal crisis, she would have done it then.
Liam, she had ruled it out after that.
Who was the Prime Minister in 2023 for most of 2023?
Okay, let's come back to let's. I think what you guys are illustrating is how much Labour's tax plan is going to matter in this debate next year, and whether a CGT actually, with the length of time it takes to return things, is going to be enough. We had David Parker on, who designed the tax plan that was kiboshed by Chris Hipkins in 2023, saying he wants all three, and you need all three to really have full impact. He wants the wealth tax, he wants the inheritance tax, and he wants the CGT tax.
And I think those things are often conflated in this debate as it was just now. Look, I think when it comes to a capital gains tax, I'm the first to say Labour has not handled that well over the years. I think they pushed it too hard when the public wasn't ready. I think they failed to adequately defend it and explain it, again, when the public wasn't ready. If you look at polls now, there's a majority in favour of the CGT. I think that the argument has been won, and you have people both on the left and in business saying it's time for a CGT. Okay. So I think the ground has...
There were polls that said that back then too.
And the real issue is whether that will be enough.
Sorry, if I can just finish my sentence. I think the ground has shifted somewhat, and similarly within Labour there's been a firming up around the need to put a tax on capital.
The real issue is, Liam, can I make this point, and I'll come back to you. The real issue is, and Liam's making this point, with the CGT alone is going to fill the vacuum that will be left if they restore the pay equity claims.
Well, I haven't come prepared with my spreadsheets. But,
I don't know that Labour has.
But certainly, the other point I've made is there are other tax cuts. There are other tax cuts this government has made that could be repealed. I mean, again, there's $6.6 billion in investment boost. There's $3 billion in the landlord tax cuts. So this starts to add up pretty quickly.
So Neale, you do realise the investment boost is only an acceleration of existing depreciation that can be claimed. Over the long term, it evens out.
Yeah, but it's not
something you can add right away.
It does come with a cost. That's why there's a cost line in the budget.
The cost of money. That's not $6.6 billion.
Really. Okay, can I move on to KiwiSaver? Because this, again, is becoming an interesting conversation and affecting a lot of people. Those over 180 don't get the subsidy, but the ones who are impacted are everybody else for whom it halves. And not only that, the 4% increase to compulsory super to be matched by your employer is an interesting one, Liam, because many have said we should be saving at least that and more compulsorily.
Yeah.
However, what is becoming increasingly clear, and Treasury's own expectation is that increase to 4% from the employer is going to be eroded. It's going to be offset against future wage increases. So again, the worker is going to see over the lifetime of their KiwiSaver perhaps a higher balance, but they're going to put a hell of a lot more of it in themselves. And is this going to become another issue that National finds itself defending?
Yeah, they'll be putting a lot more of it into themselves, and so will, of course, their employers.
Yeah, but the point is, look, anyone who's on a total REM knows now it's a fiction that that your employer contributes to your KiwiSaver.
And Treasury says 80% will come from low wage increases.
You can either have it as KiwiSaver or you can have it in your salary, right? So total REMs get that now. But the point is that for workers who are negotiating future wage increases, the Treasury is saying a portion of those wage increases will be less because of the KiwiSaver increase.
Right. Okay. Well, that's a fair point, and that's true of anything. I guess you are correct. There's no hiding around the fact that actually it means that people will be contributing more to their own retirement savings, and even though the balances will be higher, it will be more deferred from what they've earned during their lifetime. Another word for that is savings. And so what we're doing is we're softly requiring more savings. Still quite generous by international standards, and still not near the sort of level of contribution that's required in Australia, where balances are much, much higher.
And so are
expect that
salaries.
actually,
That's the whole situation we
Yes.
find ourselves in, right?
yeah, that's right. But you can't just start from that point. But the point is that it's going to. I expect it'll probably increase further in the years to come.
Okay, can we talk? Unless you want to have a word on KiwiSaver.
No, I think I've said my piece on that.
Okay, let's talk about the Te Pāti Māori suspension situation. I don't think anyone saw this coming. I don't know why we didn't. There were expectations the Tuesday of last week before the budget that there might be a long filibuster to delay the vote on Te Pāti Māori's, the MP's suspension, the toughest suspension that's been seen in the case of two of them at least. I think actually in all three of them. What the government did was use its majority to suspend this debate now till after the budget. What are you making in the first instance of the suspension itself, Neale?
I think 3 weeks as a proposed suspension was completely out of line. It doesn't track with any precedent. There are other similar cases that have led to just a censure or a far lower punishment. And you even had one ACT MP asking for advice on imprisoning the Te Pāti Māori MPs, which may not have been serious, but even then it's a bad sign. I think the governing parties, I should also point out they didn't even get opposition support for this. So it looks very much like the governing parties unilaterally trying to punish their political opponents an exorbitant amount. I think actually rather than punishing Te Pāti Māori, I think it's actually played right into their hands. Te Pāti Māori openly thinks Westminster democracy is a colonial institution that they thumb their noses at, and they like to create social media theatre out of how they're discriminated against because they can't wear a tie, or they have to wear a tie, or they can't wear Reeboks, or they're being pulled before the Privileges Committee. Te Pāti Māori loves this, and so I think the government has both behaved unjustly towards Te Pāti Māori, and they've also handed Te Pāti Māori a political victory.
Liam, your take first as a lawyer, actually, on the suspension and the fact it was not a consensus. It was a very slim majority on the actual suspension numbers.
Well, it's not a legal question in any way, shape, or form. It's just not. It's a completely political decision about the House's ability to regulate its own affairs. One thing that Neale said that was incorrect is he said that it's out of line with similar precedents or similar examples. There are no precedents. There are no precedents in New Zealand for a solemn vote being interrupted in the way that it was. There are no precedents for a leader of a political party appearing to mime the execution of, or at least the shooting of government MPs. There are no precedents for that. And I would put it to Neale that if an ACT MP did that to Jacinda Ardern, he would not be so sang-froid about it. He would be apoplectic. It is a unprecedented punishment, but the offence is also unprecedented. Now, does it play into Te Pāti Māori's hands? Yeah, probably. But at some point, the government actually just has to take a stand against this continual contempt for the House, pulling out all the stops to make sure that Te Pāti Māori could, in fact, be there for Budget Day, and the leaders didn't show up anyway. It's an ongoing situation of contempt for Parliament, and the idea that Parliament has to be powerless before this type of repeat behaviour, is just absurd.
We had an MP last year, left their seat and went and berated an MP in their face, and that was a censure, and that seemed appropriate at the time.
Because she apologised straight away. Te Pāti Māori have not apologised
and don't get me wrong,
whatsoever.
I think most reasonable people...
What?
Liam, you're like a chihuahua today. Just calm down, mate.
Stop it.
My point is, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be some kind of punishment for the breach of the rules. That's a given. But 3 week suspension, that seems, most commentators have said that seems out of line with other precedents. And I think, you can exaggerate and say they were trying to pretend they were, pointing a gun at David Seymour. I think that's getting a bit silly. They did a haka. It was an emotional moment. It was a breach of the rules. There should be some kind of punishment, but 3 weeks is ridiculous.
You're completely wrong to say that it's an exaggeration. Look, anyone with eyes can see what happened as they exited the chamber, Neale. And if you want to say that you're in favour of punishment, and you think that it needs to be in line, don't cite as precedent something that's completely different that involved contrition, involved apology. Don't say it's a haka in the chamber when Penny Hehir also did a haka and also wasn't subject to any similar sort of punishment or recommendation, because he also apologised, because he also didn't do the thing that Te Pāti Māori did. It's completely wrong to conflate those two things.
We'll agree to disagree there, Liam.
Okay. Hey, thanks both. Lively session. I thank you for your time, Liam Hehir and Neale Jones.